Changemaker 20 Summit, a convergence of visionaries and change agents igniting global transformation. Through collective innovation, we embark on a journey to conquer challenges, spark inspiration, and pave the way for a radiant tomorrow, a shared endeavor shaping the future we vision. Distinguished attendees of the Changemaker 20 Summit, we now welcome you to today's panel discussion. The session acknowledges that climate change disproportionately affects women and marginalized communities, leading to gendered impacts influenced by socioeconomic factors like age, gender, and caste. Our esteemed panelists, each of force in their respective domains, are here to ignite conversations that transcend boundaries and open new avenues for positive impact. Today we have with us the CEO and founder of Kubernein Initiative, Ms. Priyanka Bhide, our moderator for today. Ms. Bhide is a strategy and communication specialist with over a decade of experience of working with the private and not-profit sectors in South Asia, North America, and Europe. Ma'am, please take the stage, and without further ado, let's commence this invigorating exchange of ideas. Over to you, Ms. Bhide.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on inclusive climate action at the city level. I welcome all our audience members and also our very excellent panel of speakers. We have with us Rohit Magotra, who is the Deputy Director of Integrated Research and Action for Development, joining us from Delhi, correct, Rohit? Yes. And we also have with us Avni Mishra, who is a gender research consultant with Alliance of Biodiversity International and CH20, who is joining us from Dublin, I believe. Yes, Avni's video was a bit hazy, but that's the challenge with technology that we have to contend with. That's okay. We will also have Prachi Shevgaonkar join us a little later. She's on the road, and as soon as there she is. Okay, great timing, Prachi. We have Prachi Shevgaonkar, who is the founder of Cool the Globe, a very fantastic app, which I will give you more information on. She will as well a little later. But the idea today was to have a free-flowing discussion, a conversation, so that we can all come together to build more knowledge on how really we may intentionally prioritize the voices as well as the well-being of women, youth, marginalized communities in the way we plan for city-level climate action going forward. But before I get to the panelists and my question, I would like to invite my colleague Namrata Kabra, who's also from Kubernein Initiative. A little bit about Kubernein Initiative. We are a policy advisory firm and think tank based out of Mumbai, India, and we work on gender and foreign policy. We also work on sustainability and climate action and integrate a lot of our gender and climate work in everything that we do. Integrate gender, in fact, in everything that we do. Namrata leads our work on gender and climate action. She comes from a climate background, but she is also a trained lawyer and has studied climate law. So I will hand over to her to give us just a brief presentation to set the context up for the conversation, after which then I will go to the panelists with questions. And I will also take on audience questions as they come, or we have some time kept at the end of the session as well, just for an audience interaction. So do send in your questions and I'll be happy to integrate them with mine as well. Over to you, Namrata.
Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you, Changemakers, for allowing us to host this interesting session. And so, as Priyanka has already mentioned, we'll be giving a context on gender and inclusivity in climate action. This is an ongoing work that Kubernein Initiative has been promoting and writing intensely about. But let us begin by thinking at what gender and climate means. And when you just do a plain Google search, you'll see these media articles popping up, which read as they are and reading as it is. Climate change puts more women at risk for domestic violence, air pollution is worsening reproductive health outcomes for women, a study of in Bihar, women face floods and increasing violence. Water wives of Maharashtra, which is due to lack of water, there is polygamy in a particular village in Maharashtra. Women's lives getting harder in Bundelkhand. Mountain women wearing brunt of climate change, women wearing brunt of climate forced migration, either when they are migrating or their partners are migrating. And lastly, how South Asian women are missing in climate change debates. The evidence on gender and climate change is becoming intensely clear, and we see this coming up every now and then. So it begs the question of what really we mean by gender and why do we need gender just climate action. Simply to begin, let's look at the term gender, which means that socially ascribed roles, values, and responsibilities, as well as opportunities that are associated with women and men. This is what differentiates gender roles, and that's where the impacts are rising from. The integrated panel on IPCC, basically Integrated Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific body addressing and taking evidence of different impacts of climate change across the world, clearly mentions that the impacts on gender is not because of biological sex, but it is because of these socially ascribed roles, responsibilities, and opportunities that kind of differentiates these impacts. And when we talk about justice or attaining climate justice, the sole idea is to safeguard the rights of the most vulnerable people. And as we observe gender through the different layers of marginalization, are amongst the most poor or most vulnerable people, and they bear the burdens and benefits of climate change very differently, which should not be the case. And it's a very strong principle advocated across the world that while working on climate action, no one should be left behind. And therefore, this conversation today on why we are promoting gender just climate action. There are three inherent factors that continue to perpetuate gender differentiated impacts, starting with vulnerability, which is either actual or perceived. And as mentioned again before, it's coming from socially ascribed roles, responsibilities, and opportunities. The next thing is about decision making. Either there is complete lack of involvement of women and other genders in decision making, or whether it's partial or cursory, but there is still not full and meaningful participation of gender when it comes to addressing responses towards climate change, as well as in terms of benefit sharing, where we have a lot of action on climate change happening across the world, but still the beneficiaries of such climate action or such climate adaptation and mitigation programs is not yet directly addressing these gender differentiated impacts, which then continue to perpetuate these vulnerabilities. Now, looking at how India's climate policy landscape is, we have a very strong and layered policy which began from 2009 in National Action Plan on Climate Change, which sets forth the basic ground of differentiated impacts on India in terms of climate change and has laid down some 7 to 8 missions under it. There are state action plans on climate change, and very recently there is city level action plans on climate change. All of these are kind of adhering towards India's international commitment through nationally determined contributions 2015 and 2022, which is part of the Paris Agreement. Both the NDC and NAPCC recognize that impacts of climate change will be particularly severe on women. But as we have been researching and reading up and also engaging with policymakers, we see that even now there is a huge gap towards addressing this issue. That how do we reduce the impacts on women? Very recently, we had hosted a conversation on gender and climate change conversations in Delhi with different stakeholders. And some of the key recommendations that emerged out of this conversation was that we need systemic change with greater access to knowledge. We need to collate gender disaggregated data to therefore determine how the impacts are differentiated and where are the exact places where interventions can be sought. And while talking about climate change, of course, finance is a very important aspect. But within the finance, we need to have a gender budgeting specifically allocated to address this gap. And lastly, bottoms-up approach, which means integrating active citizens and community-led initiatives. Because if you're observing from various examples, there is change happening at ground level, but it's yet to be kind of translated into policy action. In this discussion, we also discussed about this paper on which has analyzed all the 28 state action plans of climate change in India and kind of observe what is the kind of approach that different state action plans have taken. And it's been observed that mostly it is either gender blind, which is completely ignoring that gender differentiated impacts exist, or it is gender neutral, which kind of recognize that there is vulnerability and there is a very typical categorization of women as victims of climate change, or in some cases women as virtuous who are able to adapt to climate change or who will be able to shape solutions. But what we need to do, as has been mentioned in this paper and what Kubernein Initiative also strongly aligns with, is to move towards gender transformative policy recognition, which essentially means that looking at women as active agents of change with key capacities to contribute. And for that, what we really need to do is mainstreaming gender and inclusivity in urban frameworks, because we're talking about urban frameworks right now, but basically in all kinds of frameworks of policy making, not just climate change, but all frameworks to address various kind of issues like water security, public transport, and environmentally social behavior, climate finance, and governance at a larger scale. By ensuring women are given such equal opportunities and capacities to shape urban development, what we're really intending is to build cities that are environmentally sustainable, socially just, and inclusive, while also being economically viable for everyone. And therefore, when we talk about gender and gender integration, it needs to be integrated into the larger policy landscape, but not in a silo. It has to be along with all the other solutions that exist. It cannot exist in isolation that, okay, this is a gender box and you do a particular checkbox kind of tick. It has to be integrated, and this is one example from our report on to build urban policy future for water and climate resilience. By doing so, what we're going to achieve is like eliminate the structural inequalities that exist in society, which are the root cause for creating this gender differentiated impacts, and to achieve gender justice or climate justice, what we really need is an inclusivity perspective into all policy making. In today's discussion, we have a very distinguished change makers, I would say, not panel, but change makers who are going to be sharing different practices from ground, and also sharing how they have had inclusive approach as well as gender responsive approach at different levels, and why cities need to look at inclusivity in urban climate paradigms. That is all from me. Thank you so much for listening in, and looking forward to the panel discussion. Back to you, Priyanka.
Thank you very much, Namrata. While I will be monopolizing this and leading this panel discussion, Namrata will be with us. So if anybody listening in has questions, then I might pull her into our conversation as well. But thank you very much for setting that up for us, Namrata. So let's begin. I am going to launch right in with my question. And the first question is actually going to be to Rohit. Rohit, for those who don't know, is a leading expert on developing plans for that integrate climate action at the urban level, and there are of course various sides to it, right, Rohit? As we know from your research as well, there are small climate change. There are small aspects of climate change that compound and have large effects. And then on the other side, there's also climate disaster and how do you build resilience to that. And I know you have experience across the board and integrating some of that in policy, and how you kind of move that conversation within the policy sphere as well. So picking up on something that Namrata presented to us, right? How do you then make these policies that are both bottom up and bring in these aspects?
So thank you, Priyanka, to organize this session. And as I have been interacting with the Cuban in the past, so I give you a lot of credit to bring this conversation to actually the mainstreaming of this issue when you look at the policies. So I think you are doing a wonderful job in terms of bringing this issue and raising it at various levels at the grassroots, at the policy and the action level. So thank you for that. And the today's session is of extreme interest to me. So as a development professional, I have been working on subject with respect to climate change in cities for the last 10 years. And as a part of this work, I had a center within IRADe, which is Sustainable Urban Development. And IRADE is a research think tank, and it works on a lot of issues pertaining to the development context in Asia. So particularly, we look into issues around energy, poverty, climate change, which is a major domain of IRADE's work. So climate change and cities is one subject where I have worked extensively over the last 10 years, and I've engaged with more than uh, 25 cities across South Asia to look at what are the various issues around the climate change context with respect to the cities. And why cities? Because this is a most important part of the climate action as well as the climate mitigation solutions. So the impact of also the when you're talking about climate impacts, they are also affecting the cities most. And when you talk about the GHG, the emissions which are coming, they are also coming from the cities. So we are also a part of a problem and also part of a solution if we want to. So most of the debates which are happening around the climate. So primarily there are three kind of issues which are broadly when we look at the climate conversations. So since in the last presentation it was highlighted the India's NDCs, India's climate action plans, state level climate action plans, city level climate action plans. So I think when we look at this planning component, the planning component is core to the adaptation work which happens in the country. And when we look at the intervention side of it, when we look at a lot of action which are taken in mitigation, how cities should mitigate the impacts of the climate. And third, which I think is also extremely important given the context, is also negotiations. How to bring these negotiations, and this is one subject I think where there is an extreme importance to bring on the top that what is that which needs to be prioritized. It's not like north south divide in terms of looking at developed versus developing. What I think within the core issue is that how do we bring this context of the vulnerable into the whole debate. And that should be the kind of a pivot around which the conversations should be made. So we talk about loss and damage. So loss and damage is very critical for when we look at the global south. But when we talk about the loss and damage, what West ascribes is a kind of medium level kind of a risk. What when we look in that particular state or the city, but if we see the composition of the population, the vulnerability status of the people, then it's not medium, it's bound to be high. So that is one fact which doesn't come into the conversations, and that is where when we talk about the vulnerability or vulnerable groups being kind of prioritized and also being looked at from the ones who are the basis of the negotiation. So it's not just a demography or a geography or the size of the nation per se, but in terms of how vulnerable they are. And when we talk about the vulnerability, then there is a layering. When you talk about people who are low income groups, then you talk about the children, the elderly, the women, and again the people who are not involved in the decision making. So poverty is one critical issue. So I think there are layers to it, but when we are at the top of it, we have to keep in mind when we are talking about any climate resilience action planning, or bringing the forefront of who is going to bear the brunt of the climate change. So I think that's one thing which is very, very key to kind of bring this into the policy debates. Number two, I think the key issue which is there in most of the policies, whether national, state, city, or what now, there are ward level policies also. I think none of them is decentralized. It's not bottom up actually. So though we talk about this policy which exists on the top of it, India has to achieve its NDCs, so it comes from the Paris commitments. So the Paris commitments are going down, and then we are looking at what kind of actions are required at states, which are then transferred to the cities, and so on. But the point is that whenever we think of any policies, particularly my experience with respect to disaster-related policy or climate hazard-related policy, none of them have approach where they look into the voices of the vulnerable population. So I think that is one key when we are talking to bring that is a key actually to bring the inclusivity. So I think when we are looking at the inclusive and the gender lens, we have to look at the policy from the perspective of that whether the voices, concerns, and the impacts which are likely to happen to these communities are included. So and that's where the lot of options with respect to the adaptation solutions come into the forefront. So we can when we're talking about, let's say, heat, that is the one subject where we have worked with around 6 cities in South Asia, including Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and several cities in India. So there we see that when we look at the solutions which emerge from the adaptation side of it, then cooling is something it's something which is not adaptable by all when you talk about low income groups. So they are not the ones who can actually just actually get ACs, air conditioning installed in their houses, and they are able to adapt per se. So these kind of solutions don't work for them. So the lens which has to be looked at when we're looking at a development planning and the solution, then we have to look at 3 aspects of it. It's like affordability of the solution, the acceptability of the solution, and the third is which looks into the cultural, the cultural realities of the of the community. So I think these 3 are very key. So what the policy making paradigm right now, when we look at these policies, they are actually top down. So no change will happen unless we bring up a kind of a conversation, we bring up the action and the planning component from the bottom. So I'll give you one example. First, when we looked at a heat as a critical issue, which is affecting city and likely to also worsen the living of several millions of the people in the cities. So what we found is that the policymakers don't consider heat as an issue. Actually, there are a lot of issues with respect to day-to-day issues of municipalities in provision of water supply, in provision of electricity and sanitation. So this is something which is not a priority issue for them. Now, how do we kind of bring this evidence to the policymakers, that yes, it is likely to be, a critical issue. So policymaker won't just understand a language of anecdotes, this affected these people somewhere, this is how it is happening. So that is where, the interdisciplinarity of the solutions have to come. So, so the policymakers would only kind of accept that, that this is an issue once you bring the evidence actually. So the evidence is very major key, that. So during our studies, we identified that, how the heat is affecting the vulnerable section of the society, how they are affecting them more than others. So that is one fact which has to be bring in forefront. Now, second is when we were doing this work, the general concern is that, this outdoor people are highly, they're vulnerable to the impact of heat. When we studied this issue, we found that humidity is an important factor, and women are the ones who are staying indoors. They are working indoors. The environment of their houses, whether in the kitchen or their workspaces, ventilation, that is a critical problem. And what our research brought out that women are suffering more. They are suffering more to heat exhaustion, compared to their male counterparts. So this is something which can't be just brought out on the basis of just kind of giving them a narration. So the core issue is that unless our research is focused on bringing these facts, these researches has to be designed in the way that they are able to highlight the core issues. So then only it will become the planning, it's becoming a kind of a planning conversation with the city. Now, B is that adaptation measures. What kind of adaptation measures women will take with respect to this. So a lot of factors are there. Cultural factors are there. Access to kind of those services are there. For example, women not using toilet if they're public toilets. Because of that, they are having diseases which are affecting their kidneys. So the sanitation is linked to the heat issue also. Then again, the supply of the water, how do they access water, how do they access health services, whether the health service. So a lot of these instruments, unless they are part of policy research design, we are hardly able to make it that. The core issue which I want to highlight here is that we need to have more evidence-based research on these issues when we are looking at a climate planning or climate action. Number two, their involvement in the decision making. How do you engage them in the decision making process? So one of the core insight which we had is from this research is that how do you present the data, to the policymakers? So this is a simple tool which is gender disaggregated data. So you have to disaggregate that data and then showcase that in a household how the decision making process is happening within the community. A woman is earning, whether she has access to the channels of the communication, whether the early warning system reaches to her, how she will decide actually in terms of the this climate calamity and climate planning, and what is she needs to kind of play an important role in the decision making, and her participation is enhanced. So that is very critical. And third aspect which we brought is the vulnerability mapping. The vulnerability, though you have a lot of policies and plans, what vulnerability mapping is hardly done at a level whereby you can increase the targeted and the focused action on the community. For example, if we identify locations where women don't have access to water or the health services, then we are immediately able to kind of inform the policy makers or the city decision makers, municipal corporation, the water supply is a problem. So while you identify that, which factor is causing problem where, because you don't have a straight jacketed kind of a solution for the whole city. So it's very important while we are coming with any such recommendation, we need to have understanding of a kind of what is required where, so it's not one kind of a solution which is going to work. And another factor is that how do you a lot of cool roof problems work, because there was enabling of access to finance, low cost financing, access to finance which funds climate solutions, that is also a critical factor. So these kind of the issues, when we look at the gender or inclusivity of these plans, these are actually far-fetched unless we are able to do more research and engage with the policymakers on this issue to then devise these plans. We develop ward level action plans for the cities, and then the interventions were taken. We improved the early warning systems in saying that the current heat thresholds are much higher to come to the lower level. What kind of advisories work for women? What kind of communication channels? So I think it itself is a great investment. Where research is a great investment, and that's what needs to be promoted. If we want a kind of a clearly evidence-backed, fact-based, adoption of the communication plan. Second issue I want to highlight with respect to, we recently started looking at the urban flooding guidelines. The urban flooding guidelines has emerged as a major challenge for India. It's like, and the aftermath of it is actually affecting much more the vulnerable communities, because they are the ones who are on the low lying lines. They are the ones whose houses will be like kind of completely destroyed by water, whether they are on the floodplains or They are again on the low-lying plain. So there we are right now engaging with the again another organization, Mahila Housing Trust, and also with the NDMA to actually develop policies which are vulnerable community focused policies and which has gender impacts. So I think the policy level, what inputs are required is to have more research engagement, bring those evidence to the policymakers, engage with them for the policy change. So this kind of a cycle does not happen. So government gives, this is the policy framework, you work in the days, and when you review such policies, you will hardly find actually even mention of the term vulnerable or even the mention of the term gender inclusive. So we are still very far in terms of coming to a level where actually people understand what are you talking about gender sensitivity, how do you make your plans gender sensitive, how to integrate with your gender sensitivity in the action plans. So I think that's a core theme which has to also work in sync with the frameworks, because hardly there are any frameworks available in terms to understand assess the vulnerability, what kind of a scorecards like gender scorecards when we are looking at from the policy planning instruments or from the action climate action perspective. So what I want to bring is that there is a lot of vacuum which exists and there is not much which is being done with respect to the core, if we want to really bring an effective plans, unless we have inclusive and gendered plans, the impact of those plans will be very, very limited. And unless it comes from the bottom up, you are actually ignoring the majority of the people who have to take the action, because they are the one who are affected and they are the ones who have to take action also. So that element can be actually strengthened more and more to kind of bringing the policy research gaps, bringing it to the forums, engaging with the policymakers to bring the change. And I think this session actually gives us some dimensions in terms of what is lacking. We are not talking about solutions which are actually hard to find, but what is existing and how that can be scaled, how that can be adapted. It's a 1x conversation, but if you have a 100x conversation, we have to build this network where more and more
reaching. If I may interrupt you slightly, but the network that we're reaching, aiming to reach through this through the change makers is also quite massive. And you very rightly point out, and I'm so grateful that you're being so frank here on this platform, that there is definitely a vacuum, right, in terms of where the strategies and plans are and how they're missing this critical information on vulnerable groups that are affected more during when the climate is hotter, when there is more water and there is more flooding. And then how do you actually activate tools to bring those voices up? How do you, I mean, I know your organization is doing some fantastic work in terms of research and building that evidence, but how do you build that evidence in a more natural way to feed into these plans? And how do you then ensure that this evidence building is also financed? And how do you, what are the new tools that can be used there, right? So actually, I hope I didn't interrupt you, but I would like to then bring in Avni here that might have some perspective, because she has been, and we will come back to you again, Rohit. I have some more for you. So Avni has been working, I know, on the technology side of it and how technology might. Avni has disappeared just as I've asked the question.
Oh no, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Your video disappeared. But so, I mean, if we could get you in to talk about how technology can play a role in, promoting more gender responsive planning, and how it could be used to strengthen the evidence for these and challenges to doing that.
All right, I think there is some challenge with my video, so I'll just turn it off so that my audio is perfectly fine, I guess. So with respect to tech, I think there has been it's been a while since I've been working on this, and we've been trying to figure out how really tech can support women when it comes to using it for their own benefits in the backdrop of climate change. So let me first start by giving out the challenges with technology. The many challenges with technology is, of course, and I think Rohit also mentioned this when he was speaking, is of course there are socio-cultural aspects to it. How it's being designed. Is it being designed for women? Is it being used by women? Do they have a training and understanding of how to use the tech? Is a key. And then of course is usually tech is designed keeping men in mind, and it's beneficial for men. So is there anything available for women? A lot of times when tech is also designed for women, it is designed keeping those gender ascribed roles in mind. So that's a big challenge, that it's catering or it's furthering the already restrictive roles that are there. That's one thing. And also there is this whole aspect of how control is yielded through this tech. How the ownership of technology also leads to the control of that technology and how the use of that technology. So keeping all these things in mind, and then keeping the wider challenge of climate change in mind, we basically, in my organization, we started working on this project. It's still ongoing. It's called, basically, we thought that if, like, of course, building tech is one thing, but then using the tech available right now is another thing. And how can we make it more accessible to women and more useful for women in general was the idea. And we started basically working on these socio-technical innovation bundles. So we decided that only access to tech will not lead to a change, will not lead to women using it for their own good, will not lead to women using it to, curb GHG emissions or adaptation strategies and all. So we thought that it's important that we club it with a lot of social innovations, basically where apart from technology, we also, like Namrata also said, it does not exist in silos. It has to be integrated with other formulas. So the idea was then, of course, that we bring in social innovations that with their technology so that it can be beneficial. So, for example, a lot of our interventions then were around clubbing. For example, there was that, and it's just an example, and I'm sorry if I'm bringing in a rural example because this is quite famous. It was drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is widely used across the countries and across South Asia. And we realized that in Nepal, we did these studies where we saw that females were, when given access to training, when given access to market linkages along with drip irrigation, it had a major impact on their water savings as well as their earnings. So just giving them drip irrigation would not really improve their resilience or their livelihoods or their incomes. It's important that they're given a training on how to use it. They're also given access to markets where they can sell those products that they are reaping from the drip irrigation tech, and that as a whole will have an impact on them. This was a very important point that we noted, and then a lot of our forthcoming interventions were then based on this. So similarly, we did this whole livestock insurance program, basically where we realized that availability of insurance schemes will not really lead to women using them until unless we do enough information exchanges with pastoralists and women pastoralists, and also we provide them micro loans that enables them to access financial services. So they're not scared that if anything goes wrong with the loans or with climate change, creating an impact on livestock, they can always fall back on that insurance. So it was a lot of intermingling of a lot of innovations together with tech that can support women going forward. And that's one lesson that I think I take from my experience, is how tech can really go a long way if combined with a lot of other incentives for women.
Guys, I got cut off and I couldn't complete my question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
But I of course wanted to hear, how you think technology could play a role in bringing in some of these voices and creating this bottom-up approach, which you spoke about right now. But also, what might be the potential risks and challenges then also in the use of this technology, um, as policymakers perhaps look to technology for their evidence in decision making.
Sure. So, see, again, I think technology comes with a lot of aspects to it. One is around its use, one is around its maintenance, one is around its understanding and access and everything. And we're realizing that a lot of times when the whole idea is just, or the program or the project is just based on providing that technology, it usually would not lead to its use. And I think one tech where we are seeing this quite a lot, and I can say it for sure, at least from the rural areas, is that solar panels have been provided to so many women farmers and women farming households in the rural country. They are not being used. We're realizing that their usage is very limited, considering maintaining them is a challenge. The villagers and those households having an understanding of how to maintain it being a challenge, last mile connectivity on its maintenance and on its issues is a challenge, and that's one big area that we're facing. Like, at least the areas that I have been working in is what we're facing. So that's one thing. There was another very, like, it was long back, and I think we've seen the results that came out from this whole solar-based cook stoves also being given out to women, and then it being like the whole idea being pushed across urban households which still rely on outdoor cooking and all. Fuel-based cooking or fuel-based cooking and everything. We realized that a lot of women ultimately went back to what they were doing because of its maintenance. Because maintenance was a challenge. Often they had to rely on the men of the households to maintain it or to keep it or to repair it, and therefore that became such a hassle for women because men were always not available to do that task, that they eventually went back to using fuel-wood cooking and going back to that. So these are the risks and challenges that come with tech. We need to have a system in place, a whole structure in place where everything is streamlined. It's made easier when women are out there and using such tech, that if they have some challenges, they're able to access solutions. Also, they're given that training that they can deal with those challenges on their own. So yeah. That I think I would suggest are risks and challenges that we often face.
Yes, thank you, Avni, also for shedding light on how complicated and at the same time integrated some of these challenges are. Right, something that even Rohit mentioned. Yeah. It's just not. Yep. You cannot. I mean, mapping this vulnerability is also a big task in itself because they're all so interconnected. And so now I'll bring the next question to Prachi Shevgaonkar, who is a climate innovator and has created the Cool the Globe app, which has people from over 110 plus countries, is what I read. And Prachi, you have actually gone on ground and spoken to people, farmers, youth, and all. I've traveled across India to understand how climate impacts people, right? So I would love if you could share some of those stories from urban areas just to help us understand how climate impacts people. How do people understand that this is actually climate that's impacting them? Mm-hmm. And the Cool the Globe app, of course, allows citizens to interact and then integrate themselves into climate actions. So maybe some insights from that that perhaps Rohit could carry forward. How could some of that data help somebody like Rohit as well? So those are the two sides to my question for you.
Okay, great. No, thank you so much, Priyanka, for that wonderful question. And I was so happy to, I learned so much from Rohit sir and Avni as well. And so it was so nice to hear about your grassroots and work and nuance perspective. So I'm glad you asked me last because I could soak in all the wisdom. But to be very honest with you, Priyanka, I traveled across the country not to understand how climate change is impacting people, but to run away from climate change. So, um, I, you know, when before before I went to college, I decided to take a year off to figure out how I can make some kind of a difference through my career. I knew I wanted to do something in the impact space, and I remember reading up about what are some of the key challenges in front of the world today, and climate change came top of the list. All global organizations, newspapers, governments, all of them were talking about how climate change is the most pressing issue in front of us. But then I kept thinking, why isn't nobody around me talking about this? So I read up more about it. I read up about coastal erosion, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, loss of biodiversity, melting glaciers, and it sounded very scary. But then I had a moment of honesty with myself, and I thought, I don't think I care enough about this. I at that time I felt like our cities face enough problems. I cared about illiteracy, I cared about gender parity, I cared about inequality, I cared about education, I cared about poverty, and I felt like, why should I care about polar ice melting in some other part of the world? So I decided to leave climate change and travel across India, trying to figure out which other areas I could do something in, and trying to understand what are the real grassroots challenges facing our nation. And so, in order to do that, I reached out to my role models, social entrepreneurs, NGOs, whose work I really admire, and I asked them if I could shadow them for a couple of months. And I also reached out to grassroots communities that I really wanted to spend time with. And so during the course of that, I spent several months traveling with farmers across Maharashtra, spent many months working on ground with waste workers, spent many months teaching children in small villages and towns across India. And during the course of this time, I kept seeing, till then, I'd only read about climate change in reports and in newspapers. But during the course of this year, I met some people who were facing the catastrophic impacts that I had only read about till then, and they changed my entire perspective about it. I remember meeting a 12-year-old boy when I was making a film on children and what their dreams look like. And I asked him, if you could ask for anything in the world, you get one wish and you can ask for anything, what would you ask for? And I'd never forget his answer, because he said, I would wish that my house doesn't get filled with water again. Now, when I said that, I went back home and realized that he was not alone. There are millions of people every year whose homes get destroyed because of extreme weather events like floods, like wildfires. And as these events start happening more frequently and more intensely because of climate change, there would be more and more young boys like him who have to worry about something as basic as a shelter above their head. And this I cared about. I remember meeting another young girl when I was volunteering for an NGO that worked in education. And I asked her, which standard are you in? She said, I don't go to school these days. Why is that? It was because her town was seeing a drought. The water body nearby had dried up and she was getting water only for 2 hours in the afternoon. Nobody else in her family could afford to stay at home during that time, so she had to. And this was when I realized that climate change can also impact our water. It can also impact our education. It can also mean that a bright young girl like her has to skip school and stay at home to fill buckets with water. And this I cared about. I was working with another community of waste workers at the outskirts of Bangalore. They were not from India, they were refugees from Bangladesh. And when I was working with them, I met one of the most inspiring people I've ever come across. She was my age at the time. She was also 18, but she was already married and she had a young daughter. Now, the day I met her, I walked with her 5 kilometers to the nearest school, where she went in and asked if her daughter could be enrolled into the classroom. But she couldn't, because they didn't have the necessary documents, neither did they speak the local language, Kannada. But this young woman, she didn't give up. For the next 2 months, every single day, she walked to the house, she walked to the school, she sat at the doorstep and she demanded that her daughter be enrolled into class. And finally, the school saw a way around the technicalities, around the language barriers, and her daughter got a place in the classroom. Not only her daughter, but all the children in the entire community got a place in the classroom. Now, what does this have to do with climate change? That's when I went back and read about climate refugees. People from around the world, I think about 13 million people every year, even now, have to escape from their countries because of sea level rise, because of extreme weather events happening more intensely, more frequently, and have to rebuild their lives from scratch, often with children in hand, like this young woman. And this I care about. An old farmer taught me more about climate change than any global expert ever could. He said in Marathi, small dwelling farmers like me just can't afford to keep doing it anymore because un पावसाचं गणितच बिघडलंय. So the weather has gotten so unreliable that we can't afford it anymore. And when I can't afford to grow food, there are 1,000 people behind me who can't afford to buy food. So climate change can also mean that more and more people go hungry. I was throughout my time on ground, I kept meeting more and more people like this. And I realized that as ordinary citizens, we don't care about the big heavy words like global warming, like coastal erosion, like melting glaciers. But we care about simple things. We care about our homes, we care about our food, we care about our livelihoods, we care about our health, and most importantly, we care about our families and the people around us. It was only when I spent time on ground that I realized that climate change is impacting all of this. And it's impacting all of the challenges we already see in our cities, and it's aggravating all of them. It's kind of like the super villain of all the villains we see in front of us today. It was only when I realized that I started thinking about what it is then that I can do about climate change. And that's how Cool the Globe was born. So let me know if you'd like me to talk about it now or in the next question. But yeah.
You could tell us a little bit about the globe and even some of the insights from it.
Yes.
Because then I have a question that I will have Rohit weigh in on.
Absolutely. So when I began really understanding the gravity of climate change and caring about it, that I began thinking about what is it then that I, as an ordinary girl, can do about a big problem like this. And in my family, we decided to take up a simple quest. We took a challenge to reduce our own personal greenhouse gas emissions by 10% every year. So I started researching on what are the simple activities I can do in my day-to-day life to reduce my emissions. And how do I measure the impact of these actions? And a few months into doing this, something very interesting happened. First interesting thing was that I began to enjoy it. It felt good that at least at my own level, I was doing something about this. And secondly, my friends, my neighbors, relatives, people around me began to take notice and said, you're doing something interesting and we want to be a part of this. So that's when I began thinking about how can I get global citizens to start taking climate actions in their day-to-day lives with me. And from this, Cool the Globe started. So from the dorm room of my college, we began building an app for climate action, which would unite global citizens. Essentially, I realized that in order to do anything at all, we need a clear target in front of us. We need to be able to measure our progress on it as well. So every user in the app gets a monthly target to reduce their personal emissions. And then they see hundreds of simple day-to-day climate actions they can integrate in their lives in order to do that. So we spent 3 years working on building the app. And by the time I graduated, it was launched. That's when we realized that now the real work starts. We've built this platform, but we need to get people on it. So we began making very simple campaigns on what the common man can do about climate change. And our message was very simple: let each one of us begin by reducing our own carbon footprint by 10% every year. So people began doing this in their own lives, and more importantly, they began telling other people about it. So one action inspired 10 others. I remember a 9-year-old girl emailed me, said that, what change can I make in my life to fight climate change? And she decided to start going to her school on a cycle instead of a car. And by doing this for a few months, she recorded saving 60 kg CO2 equivalent emissions on the app, which was 3 times her weight. Another 80-year-old woman called me and said that her granddaughter was getting married. But and instead of buying a new sari for the occasion, she had decided to reuse her own sari from her own wedding. She had decided to reuse all the outfits from her own wedding, and by doing that, she had recorded saving 10 kg CO2 emissions on the app. So people from around the world like this began getting in touch, began taking climate actions which made sense for them, which were relevant for them. And before we knew it, a lot of young people from around the world became Cool the Globe ambassadors. They started spreading awareness about climate actions in their own community, in the context of the community that they lived in. I remember interacting with a group of girls from Chandrapur, which is a small town in Maharashtra. And I'd gone to, they had signed up to become Cool the Globe ambassadors, and I'd gone to speak with them. And as we were discussing, they said many of us don't even know what climate change is. But they said that we still feel the impacts of it. The way we explain climate change to our batchmates is, we told them about how in the summer vacations it's too hot to play outside anymore. We told them about how during Diwali it's not as cold as it used to be. We told them about how when there was a flood in Chandrapur, all of us had to gather in our school, and all of us had to spend the night at the top floor of our school. So, people at the, we think that climate change, people don't know about climate change at the grassroots, but I think it's the community that has the front row seat to climate change. They may not know the word, but they're already facing the impacts of it. So we just need to bridge the gaps for them. So people from around the world, from grassroots communities, began joining in, and they were able to help us contextualize climate change for grassroots communities. And through the power of citizen-led and youth-led campaigns like this, we reach over 25 million citizens from around the world. And now, as you said, citizens from over 110 countries are using Cool the Globe app. But this is just the beginning. Because once our app started getting traction among citizens, a lot of our users called me up and said, I've been taking this climate action, but how can I get people from my school, my college, my organization and my city to join in with us? A lot of people called me up and said, I'm taking this action, but what difference can one person make? We believe that the power of climate action is in its collective impact. We think that individual actions may not matter much, but they can create an extraordinary impact when there are a lot of people coming together. And so we created a global meter on the homepage of the app, which would show in real time the collective emissions being avoided by all citizens combined. Until date, recently our global meter hit the target of saving 2.5 million kg greenhouse gas emissions. And we launched a community version of the app, which would enable organizations to sign up as a community. And in the next phase, we're also looking at having Cool the Globe app for every city, a Cool the Globe for Pune, Cool the Globe for Mumbai and for Delhi, so that citizens can gamify climate action. They can be challenges for each city, and we can see the collective impact being taken by citizens at the grassroots. So that's the vision.
Thank you, Prachi, very much for sharing this. And it's quite fascinating how you're able to, through this platform, bring on people and kind of integrate them and make them part of the climate action, right? And so I want to take this idea to Rohit and have Rohit, you weigh in on the use of technology, right? What what Prachi has done. We've lost Rohit.
No, I'm there.
Oh, you're there. Okay. I think when the video goes off, I don't see somebody. So what Prachi has done is to get people on board to kind of take action. Do you see scope for a technology like this, given the high number of smartphone penetration in our urban cities? Could we use something similar to support then you in activities like the vulnerability mapping and understanding what kind of problems these sections of society also face? Because we do have not only high smartphone penetration, but in terms of I mean, people that can use this technology even from uneducated and underprivileged sections. I think there's a high number of people that could technically use and come on board and give you some of this data. So where do you see in terms of scope of use of this technology? And I'm going to add a question that has been asked from Muskan Sharma to that, in terms of the tools that were used to assess the impact on vulnerable communities within your existing program. I think if you could just address both these questions together.
Thank you, Priyanka, and I think very inspiring story by Prachi, where she has actually, it's said that charity begins at home. I think that charity must begin from home, and any action, if it has to be be actually seen as a tool of change, then you have to be the change. So I think a very good, lesson for young people and also old across the world for curbing their emissions. And the technology has a significant role. So I think one key challenge when we face during our studies of mapping the vulnerability. So one part of this work was that we have to identify that what is the spatial differentiation of the temperature within the city. Within the city, so there are no same temperature zones within the city. So the city has different kind of a temperature, and it ranges from 1 degree to even 7 degrees. So the challenge for us is that when we look at the meteorological department set up this centers and stations, so they are generally they are very few. So for example, when we look at any city in the country, most of them would have no more than two such automated weather stations, or this centers which actually provide information on the temperature and also on the precipitation or the wind. So when we have to do this kind of a mapping for a city like Delhi, Rajkot, Bhubaneswar, so our challenge was that this information was not available, within the city. So what we did is we used satellite maps, so to understand, what kind of a temperature exists within the city, and based on that, we tried looking at what kind of a thermal map the city has and identify which are the hot zones within the city. What we called as the hot spots or the heat islands within the city. But the role of technology is very important. For example, when we are talking about such apps, so if these apps are being actually used by users across the city, and they give a feel of the temperature, they have a sensor to kind of imply that this is the temperature in this part of city where I am with my GPS location. So we are able to get an instant kind of a city map, which is a city hotspot map. So I'm able to then build this information and then inform my policymakers, and also have an early warning system. We are saying that, for example, if there is a heat wave announcement which is made at 40 degrees centigrade, okay, so I am able to inform the people who are in these locations that it's your meteorological station located at some place is 40, but it's already 43 in the city. So the action is required. So the way we are able to pool this information, that is a very excellent use of providing a technological, I would say, breakthrough of providing essential information for decision making. That's very important. Number two is that in India our heat thresholds, the early warning, the way it starts, it only has the temperature as a a factor, the maximum temperature, which is a free factor. The temperature touches 45, it's, extreme heat wave or so, 43. So like that in various regions. For the plains, we have different thresholds. For coastal areas, we are different. But we don't have an understanding of, how the humidity and the combination of the temperature, it affects, the people. And not only the people, but also, the ecosystem, the animals, the veterinary sector. That kind of information, if we are able to collate using a technology, so it gives a very kind of a clear action for, for building that evidence and building that solution through which we are able to address this, issue much effectively. B, when we look at, the early warning is very critical, and early warning can be only amplified through technology. Provision of this information, which started from, the ham radios, which looks at, the mobiles, the information in form of SMSs, WhatsApp group. So tech has a lot of role with respect to, provision of the early warning. So that is something which is important for the prevention and the management of a hazard. And that is a very key issue, because when we look at the cities, 60% of the people, they are deprived actually of the early warning. So just see how much scope the early warning system have to actually, the outreach can be actually amplified using the technology. So the tech has a key role. As I said, even to understand that what kind of thresholds should be developed for early warning, how to identify, where are the hotspots, and there are also tech-based models. For example, one case we did is that we use the models to actually see that what is the implication of, a certain level of rainfall. So, so if you have a rainfall, let's say of 20 centimeter in a day, or successive rainfall of, let's say, 15 centimeter for 3 days, then which are the areas will be waterlogged in the city? So that layer can't come just from, just a number of, like, Mumbai got 25 centimeter of rainfall in a day. But to assess and understand the vulnerability, I need to know that if this scenario happens, then which are the pockets which are going to be drowned or flooded. So that is what enables action. So the tech has, like, quite a lot of role when we look at the enabling climate action. But again, since coming back to the topic, because we're looking at inclusive climate action, I would re-emphasize that, how to bring the policy focus on inclusive climate action is very critical. And why it is critical? Because it just not affects some people, hundreds of people, thousands of the people, but millions of the people. One policy change can actually bring a kind of master stroke in terms of, making that impact felt. So individual actions, very important, very critical. But when we talk about inclusivity in climate action, we need to have the voices of the people who are affected. Actually, who are the people who are getting impacted, how they will be compensated, how do they get early warning, how to enable insurance for these communities. So that is a critical issue when we're looking at a inclusive climate action. And
yeah, in fact, we have a related question, Rohit. I'm going to put that to you, since you're already, I think, answering it, as to how might cities collaborate with local community organizations and grassroots movements to amplify diverse voices and perspectives in shaping climate policies. This question has been asked by Ashish Kumar. So, are there any examples from the extensive work that you've done where cities are trying to do this, that could be replicated in terms of bringing this inclusive approach?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is that we have to bring this information forth to the decision makers, the people who are going to take action. For example, as I talk about that, if my framework informs that this much rainfall will actually affect these regions within the city, so then for those areas there has to be a plan in terms of rescue, in terms of prevention, in terms of management. All these has to be amplified. And civil society plays the most effective role when we look at such actions. So I think when we look at the interventions, for example, for Rajkot Heat Action Plan, when we looked at how this heat action plan could be implemented, the city municipal corporation can't implement it all alone. So there you have to see in terms of who are the critical uh, points of the intervention. For example, we looked at one intervention point. We look at ASHA workers. They are the one who are engaging with these communities. Who go to these households, identify who are the women at the risk, who are the families at the risk. They inform. A. B is when we talk about the action point of view. Water access to this. Uh, Drinking water and cool water. So a lot of these religious groups, which came together, and we have a concept of providing, creating such water points, during the summer. So they created such more than 100 plus water points across the city. So there were civil society organizations, there were residents welfare associations, there were uh, the existing kind of I would say the informal institutions which were there, which volunteers, you have already some scouts, who are active in the city. So there are points of engagement. What I think the key intervention here is that we have to identify those points, keep the network alive, and not just it's a documented network but it doesn't work. But that layer only comes when you start engaging a different layer. As I said, that you could have a community CSOs, you could have civil societies, you could have religious organizations. So in many points, these were announcing, these women were announcing, that today is going to be very, very hot day. So please, stay in. So such kind of actions, they actually come from influencers also within the community. And I would say, if I have to say that who are the most critical, I think civil society. Civil society is actually is highly influential, and these volunteer networks actually help you in the implementation. Because if we look at any such intervention, the government alone can't do, and government needs an interface. So that interface is missing in most of these cases. Governments need an interface. They say that we need an interface, but there is no interface. So unless we need to create more interface points, rather like educating schools on the air pollution, how does it affect them, what to do, what kind of actions. Then there are associations, doctor associations, pharmacy associations from the health point of view. There are a lot of networks within the city, but they have to be tapped for the climate action. And to being more inclusive, you need to have interfaces. Once they act as interfaces, you will know actually what are the core issues which the communities are facing and what are their priorities. My priority as a decision maker might be very different from the priorities of the communities.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd love for Avni also to weigh in at this point on how one might make these approaches more inclusive and integrate cities with the communities.
No, I think Rohit had put it really well that it's important to tap on various networks that exist in the cities and have conversations with them, and then look at them as to how can they spread that message, that awareness, or include them in the decision making. Because we do have seen, uh, especially with respect to, let's say, water challenges and water issues, I think approaching women groups because women are primarily involved in water collections, even in the city. They spend a lot of time. I think involving them in the conversation, involving, for example, like you use the term Mahila, like you used, name the organization, Mahila Housing Trust. We did get in touch with them also to understand the challenges that can be countered when it comes to water collection, and then understanding basically asking both the challenges and also the solutions that they would want to or they would like to see when it comes to water issues. And I think that whole project went a long way because it could really impact. We did this back in Chennai because Chennai was one of the cities that has been facing major water crisis for a while now. And we realized that bringing them in the conversation can go a long way. And then having support, again, I think like you said, it's also a lot about trust and building confidence that things can work, and then having those interfaces, or having that community support, or someone on which the community trusts and someone on whom we also trust. That linkage can go a long way in pushing interventions out and pushing policies and strategies out. That's what we've also learned. So yeah, I think Rohit made some brilliant points.
A small point adding to Avni, Priyanka. I think what is the most important are conversations.
Yes,
Conversations don't happen.
I agree.
Unless these conversations happen.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you seriously, once this conversation happens, they are bringing to forefront, to the policymakers. You need to have a good patience, definitely, which is required to engage with them. I think we have seen results, by doing these conversations, engaging with the stakeholders, and bringing a perspective which is accepted, and I'm telling you, this one kind of a solution doesn't go. What could be inclusive of one city is not inclusive for the other.
True.
And it's broad basing inclusivity is also not a good thing to do. And from the gender point of view, I think most of the climate action actually happens at the level of the women.
Yes.
So you have to actually, usher this change of making that change happen, whether in terms of adoption of, the solar lamps, in terms of, a clean cooking stoves, in terms of having a cool roofs, in terms of having, buying insurance instruments to safeguard their livelihoods. This all starts with women. So unless we actually focus on them, this nothing possible which is likely to happen.
Yeah, also just to add to Rohit's point, I think it's like you said, a lot of solutions start from women, especially at climate change level. It's also important that we the whole conversation started with transformative change, right? It is so important that whenever we're talking about gender issues, we have come to realize that involving men in those conversations is as important as involving women. And I'm not saying men in the sense that we involve them with respect to projects or interventions. They already are involved. It's important to involve them in the conversations around gender and the structural barriers that women face because of gender roles and responsibilities. We've seen that has gone a long way. We understand that when you bring conversations, for example, we basically saw that there is a rise in gender violence after natural disasters. Amphan, for example, when Cyclone Amphan came, a lot of women were trafficked. They were pushed into prostitution after the cyclone came. This happened in Pakistan as well. We have examples that floods in Pakistan last year were horrendous and last year, and women were either married off earlier, they were pushed, they were sold, they were pushed into slavery and prostitution, and that's how the money was earned. It's so important that we realize that when we brought men in that conversation, when we told them about the sexual violences they faced post-disaster, it is then that they realize the hardships of women as such. And that is where I think, like you said, conversations are important. Conversations are important with both the apologies, but right now I'm just talking about two genders. So both the genders here, and it's important that they are a part of that conversation. They know how it will affect them, their household, their families, and also the women in the families.
Yes. I think informed decision making, that can only happen once you start informing them, what is available, what can be done, and how it can be done. These three tools can actually lead to a lot of these action. And I think the saddest part which I look at, the gender context to all this climate planning, it's nothing, not much is available in terms of, in terms of knowledge, capacity building. So it's hardly, it's not there. So I think unless a lot of effort has to be done with respect to, this putting the gender issues in forefront through research and action, that kind of a lens is completely missing. And as Avni talked about, building that sensitivity. Sensitivity is very critical. Unless you build that sensitivity, it's difficult to actually make that change happen. Yes, I think we are at right platform. We have started the conversation, and I think this was built on, and inclusive climate action will happen with more engagement, and that's where I
Yeah.
think this is a good start. And I think we need to keep this conversation
I mean, I
going.
would also like to point out that, one thing that Avni, you said very rightly, is that this is not a women's issue. When you say gender, it's always often thought about, oh, this is a women's issue that women need to solve. It's an issue that needs to be solved at the community level, and when it's solved, it'll help much larger contingent than just the women as well. And we also noticed that in the same way, it's often left to the women to talk about these issues.
Yeah.
And so it's really amazing to have people like Rohit in the room say these things, right? Because this is very important as well.
It's not a woman issue; it's a planet issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can't think of a planet being actually taking action at that level, and that level has to be kind of facilitated, because obviously the decision making has to be done by them, and we have to facilitate that process.
Yeah.
And facilitation channels, more and more channels are required to kind of engage, give them space, because in cities this is not, cities are kind of a geography where civil society, rather than it's like, rather than spreading, it's actually I would say it's closing, so the kind of engagement which is required in cities is much higher compared to when you look at the other geographies, where issues are definitely very important. But when we look at the concentration of the cities with respect to the low income groups and the kind of miseries they are facing and likely to face, we need to have more this this engagement points, and also increase the role of civil society within this, which is actually which is my key concern, because we are not seeing much of the civil society engagement in cities.
Yeah. We have only 3 minutes left, so I want to end with everybody pitching in their one or two ideas that you would like to leave with this excellent platform that has been created under the G20, right? This Changemakers platform that's connecting changemakers across the globe. So I know, Rohit, you have put across a very important point, which is that these conversations need to continue and happen at the scale, and we need to keep talking about this. But if I could go across the room, I'll start with Avni and then end with you, Rohit, on the 2 or 3 top items that you could recommend going forward.
So I think the two, I think I'll take from this conversation only. I think one is, I think I love working with communities. I am working with communities. I understand the importance of them, their roles in bringing change. So I think that's very important, that whenever we are having conversations around climate change, we do involve whatever level of almost at every level. I think at every decision-making level, or communities being a part of it is really important. And I think second, whenever we're discussing, we're integrating gender in the whole conversation, it's important to understand I think this is very missing, because a lot of organizations play it safe as well. Questioning structural imbalances or power dynamics that creates those imbalances and increases vulnerability of women needs to be questioned and worked upon, and in that having men as equal partners in supporting that whole movement is important. So these are my 2 takeaways or recommendations that I would like to give here.
And thank you, Avni. And very quickly, Prachi, to you, the same question.
So in the last 6 to 7 years in this space, I've got an opportunity to meet people from all walks of life, from policymakers to students to ordinary citizens to journalists to leaders. And what I've experienced is that most people want to be a part of a positive change. Most people want to do something about climate change as well. They just don't know what to do. So key thing we need to figure out, people like us who are enablers in this ecosystem, we need to figure out something to do for everybody, no matter who they are. Something to do for ordinary citizens, something to do for people from all professions, something to do for youth, something to do for leading organizations. Every single week I have multiple conversations with organizations who want to do something about climate change, who want to take meaningful climate action but don't know how. If we give solutions, people are willing to take the first step. They just don't know how. So that's the first key takeaway. And second thing, I think we also need to enable and create ecosystems for grassroots innovations and solutions to thrive. We need. I feel like people who are in touch with the ground realities can also come up with solutions that are scalable, that are practical, and even cost effective. But they just don't have the right mentorship and ecosystem to bring those solutions forward. So it's very important, even when we're talking about tech or other kind of innovations, it's important that they come from the grassroots and that communities are empowered to bring forward more solutions. And thirdly, I think in all sorts of people that I meet, what the area that I get most hope from is schools and the younger generation, people even younger than me. I often I remember there was a day when I had to speak with world leaders, and then the same evening I had to speak with a bunch of fourth graders, and I was more nervous about the second engagement, because whenever I speak with children, they're very knowledgeable, they ask the right questions, they demand answers, and they demand action. So they want to know what is the next step. So I feel like young people today have a zeal to make a difference and to bring about a change, and we need to capitalize on that zeal, and to get more and more youth as a meaningful part of climate action.
Thank you very much, Prachi. And I come back to you, Rohit, who you started us off with a very good suggestion, but if you have
Yes,
more
I
suggestions
think,
to add.
I would say, when whatever we talk about inclusivity and inclusive action, we have to safeguard, the livelihoods of the people. We have to enable, the right kind of financing instruments. And I think most importantly, so all this discussion are toothless unless, there is a policy which backs, these discussions. My key priority would be to get these into a policy which can be further adapted and implemented, and it becomes an act actually, so where the regulation is there to kind of enforce it. This is nowhere in a policy, so the action is required to get it to a policy and for a larger action. So as I engage with cities and states, I would always see that these policies are actually framed with that context, which has the voices of these communities. That is what brings inclusiveness to the policy and the action. So unless that happens, these conversations can happen in blurbs. But if we have to really need a very commendable and a kind of a committed action, we need a policy, and I will go definitely for a strong policy framework which has these actions which are suggested and owned by the people, who are likely to be the most impacted, rather than a top kind of an approach coming from the West. So I will end here. Thank you, Priyanka.
Yes, absolutely. I think combining all of your suggestions to get those grassroots voices and then somehow put them into more policy recommendations and actions that you see at the policy level. I see my brilliant colleague Namrata here as well, so I'd like to give her 30 seconds. Namrata, if you want to add anything to this as well.
Covered everything, but maybe just reiterate some of the suggestions that collating gender disaggregated data to identify where the impacts are, and also to reiterate what Rohit already mentioned is vulnerability mapping, so we understand where exactly what is happening at different wards, because even within single ward there will be different issues amongst different communities. So having those very granular mapping, I think, is really important to understand. differentiated impact set up at gender and age and children, etc. That's all.
Thank you, Namrata, and thank you once again to our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Avni. Thank you, Prachi. Thank you, Rohit, for taking the time out and joining us virtually for this very important discussion. And I hope this is the first
Camera
of many with you as well.
No, I will also like to thank you for organizing this wonderful session and bringing us together. So, lot of this when you talk about new actions and thoughts, we are always provoked.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Rohit Magotra, Miss Avni, Mishra, Miss Prachi, Shevgaonkar, and thank you so much, Priyanka and Namrata, for curating this panel. And Mr. Magotra rightly said that it's important to have these discussions. We don't talk often about these things, but these discussions are needed, and I hope and wish that we have such discussions about inclusivity inclusivity in terms of climate action at city level. Yes, thank you so much for giving your insightful contributions in this panel, and thank you all, and I hope and wish that we meet again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.